Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks to Steve and Megali and Playermaker and Fulham FC for doing this, and also for having me on. Having a look through the other panelists, I was really honored and kind of blown away by the standard of everyone speaking here. And actually, I played soccer when I was in college against Randy Waldrum when he was coaching at Notre Dame. So when I saw he was a panelist, that made me laugh a little bit. Not that he'd remember me because I was probably sat on the bench or recovering from my own injury at the time. But I am a doctor of physical therapy. I received my doctorate from Emory University in Atlanta, and that was after having played Division I college soccer at St. John's University in New York. I'm also a strength and conditioning specialist, and a lot of what I do is I work with young female soccer players, and I do promise that I'll go back and forth between soccer and football throughout this presentation. But I work with a lot of young female soccer players after an ACL reconstruction, and here in the US we have an insurance set up, whereas sometimes, actually oftentimes, unfortunately, insurance companies will stop paying for physical therapy once the athlete has reached a certain threshold, which normally is nowhere near what it needs to be to get them back on the field. So I end up kind of coming in and serving that bridge between rehab and performance. And a lot of what I do is preparedness for return to sport, both physically and psychologically, which I think is equally important. So just a little overview of what I'll go over today. First off, I'll talk about the risk of second ACL injury after a primary ACL reconstruction. So ACL reconstruction is the typical surgery that one will have after an ACL injury. And I'll talk about, is there a role in screening high risk versus low risk athletes after a primary ACL injury? Can we identify or predict who's going to go on to have a second injury? What are some things that maybe we can be better at? So I'll make the argument that our return to sport testing needs to improve and our current state of rehab programs overall. And then it's no good just complaining about something without giving some solid solutions. So hopefully I'll be able to give some good suggestions as to how we can improve this and reduce the risk of second ACL injury. So females are much more likely than males actually to go on to have a second ACL injury. And the last thing anybody wants after having this injury, having surgery, going through months of rehab, and finally getting back onto the pitch is getting that same injury again. The athlete certainly doesn't want that. Their parents, their teammates, coaches, performance staff, medical, nobody wants this to happen. Unfortunately, the reality is that about 1 in 4 young female athletes who return to level 1 sports, of which soccer, football is included, those are cutting and pivoting contact sports, 1 in 4 of them will go on to have a second injury. And in fact, girls, young female athletes, young female soccer players who do return to sport are 6 times more likely to have a second ACL injury than a teammate who has never had an ACL injury. So if I'm on a soccer team and I have torn my ACL, now I'm back to playing, and my teammate has never torn her ACL, I'm 6 times more likely to have a second injury than she is to have a first-time ACL injury. And this is most likely to occur within the first 1 to 2 years after that first ACL injury and reconstruction surgery. Now, in females, there is a trend for that second injury to occur on the opposite limb or the contralateral side, as opposed to the surgical side having a graft rupture. So that's going to be important for us to remember during the rehabilitation program. Now, can we predict who's going to go on to have a second injury? That would be really nice if we could, right? Now, some studies have looked at ways to stratify high-risk versus low-risk athletes, and they've even found some variables related to dynamic postural control and some neuromuscular variables that can help sort people into high-risk versus low-risk. But the problem is that athletes who are sorted into a low-risk group do end up getting a second ACL injury. And athletes who are put into the high-risk group, some of them end up not having a second ACL injury. Now, is age a predictor of second injury? Historically, it's been reported that younger athletes are at increased risk of a second injury, but a recent study from the Delaware-Oslo ACL cohort has found that returning to level 1 sport in the first year after an ACL reconstruction has independent association with a 6 times higher risk of another ACL injury. So in other words, your risk of having another ACL injury increases 6-fold simply by returning to sport within a year of your surgery. Now, younger athletes are more than twice as likely than older athletes, and this is defined as athletes younger than 25 or older than 25. The younger ones are twice as likely to return to level 1 sport in their first year. Further, passing return to sport testing criteria is independently associated with a 92% lower second ACL injury rate. And younger athletes are more likely to return to sport without ever having passed return to sport testing criteria. So taking those two factors combined, the authors of this study adjusted for return to sport in the first year and passing return to sport criteria. And they found that there is actually no clear association between age and second ACL injury. And in fact, it turns out age is simply a proxy for exposure to risk. So by simply going back to playing sport, you're going to be at risk of another injury. I think it's important for us to recognize that although we may be able to identify those who are at an increased risk of a second injury, we simply can't predict who exactly will go on to have a second injury. So to me, what's really the point of trying to subgroup into high risk or low risk if the object is to implement strategies and interventions aimed at reducing the risk of a second injury? We should really just be applying that to everyone who has had an ACL injury. So we do return to sport testing in order to see if an athlete is ready to return to sport and also to see if the athlete is at risk of another injury. But it's not really that dichotomous, is it? So I don't think there's ever really clear black and white answers to anything in elite sport, particularly readiness to play. So anytime an athlete steps onto the field, they're going to be at risk of an injury. So this is going to be more of a spectrum than a clear yes or no the athlete is or is not ready, or a clear yes or no the athlete is or is not at risk. There is inherent risk involved, and our job after a primary ACL reconstruction surgery is to try to mitigate the risk of a second injury. We are in no way going to be able to prevent all of them, but there are some measures we can take to help reduce that risk. So how are we assessing return to sport readiness, and what is the testing battery that's used? Now, there's no one singular testing battery that's used ubiquitously. In other words, a lot of teams and clinics will use their own testing battery, but one that has been found in the research to be pretty good at recognizing who is going to go on to have a second injury is put forth by that Delaware-Oslo ACL cohort I mentioned earlier. So what they do is they use time-based criteria in not allowing athletes to go back before 9 months. And the reason for that is they found that for every month delay in return to sport up to the 9-month mark, there was a 51% reduction in second ACL injury risk. So for me in my practice, whenever I'm working with a soccer player, an athlete, I tell them a minimum of 9 months. And if it's a youth athlete, I'm telling them more towards 12 months. Now we also have to look at objective criteria because time is not the only evidence we need to send somebody back onto the field. This testing battery by the Delaware-Oslo cohort looks at quad and hamstring strength, and LSI means limb symmetry index, and that's essentially comparing the strength of the surgical side versus the strength of the non-surgical side, and we'll talk about the flaws in that in a minute. They also do a series of 4 single-leg hopping tests, which we'll also get into in a minute, and then some patient-reported outcome measures. Now that ACL RSI on the bottom there, that's a measure of psychological readiness, which is going to be hugely important. Now, this is a model of a return to sport testing criteria that has been shown to predict or be able to assess objectively who will go on to have a second ACL injury. Of course, like I said, we can't predict everybody, and we will be wrong on some people, but this one has a 90% sensitivity, which is pretty good. The only issue is that it's very rare that athletes actually pass this standard. So in their original study on this, out of 100 athletes, it was 18 athletes actually passed. And in other research articles, the rate of passing return to sport testing batteries is usually around 20 to 23% pass rate. So we're not really adequately preparing people for this test, and the test inherently has its flaws as well. Now, how are we assessing some of these things? So how are we assessing quad and hamstring strength, for example? In the research, and ideally what we should be doing, is isokinetic and isometric dynamometry. Now, not every clinic, not every team is going to have that. In a study that surveyed physical therapists around the United States, they found that most physical therapists are measuring strength with manual muscle testing. Now, that is nowhere near sensitive enough to be able to see if somebody is at 90% limb symmetry index or 95%. And that's important because it seems that the most predictive of who will go on to have a second ACL injury is that quad strength limb symmetry index. And there's a 3% decrease in risk for every 1% increase in limb symmetry index. So for example, if somebody has a 90% limb symmetry index, somebody else has a 92% limb symmetry index, the person with the 92% is going to have a 6% decrease in risk compared to the person with 90%. So that's fairly significant. And there's no way that we can sensitively assess that enough with manual muscle testing. Now, I mentioned that there's some issues with the single leg hop tests. So the ones that will typically be used are a hop for distance, a triple hop, a 6-meter timed hop, and a triple crossover hop. Now, what are the problems with this? Well, a study by Ren et al. Found that those who do achieve symmetry, and again, here we're comparing the surgical side to the non-surgical side, the athletes who achieve symmetry, in other words, they jump as far or as fast on their surgical side versus uninvolved side, are only doing so through decreased performance on the uninvolved side. Now, since we know that young female athletes who go back to playing sports like soccer are at increased risk of re-injury, and a lot of times that occurs on the opposite side, it's important to know that they're only achieving symmetry by having decreased performance. So there's something going on with that contralateral limb as well. Susan Sigwart et al. From University of Southern California also found that there's around the 3 to 5 month mark post ACL reconstruction, there's a shift from interlimb compensations to intralimb compensations. So essentially, instead of loading the knee during deceleration, hopping and landing, and changing direction tasks, even something like a squat in Sigwart's research, they're now shifting that load out of their involved knee and into the hip and the ankle. Now, these tests are still useful, and I still use them because we can see when they go really wrong. So this is the uninvolved limb. And then over here, oops, let's go back. Over here, we have the involved limb. So you can see our hesitancy there, right? And then that landing. So we can tell when things are really god-awful. And just as a side note, this athlete was cleared to go back to playing soccer full-time without restriction about a month before I took these videos. Not cleared by me, just was cleared in general to return to soccer. And I think we can all agree based on those videos that she is nowhere near ready. Now again, these hop tests can still give us some good information. It can tell us if somebody is fearful of jumping and landing off of that leg. We can see if they're getting full triple extension. We can look at their power production, their force absorption. So there's a lot of things that we can take a look at. So it is useful to still look at this, but maybe not as our objective criteria in and of itself, because a single leg hop is nowhere near the demands of playing soccer. So again, it's no good complaining about what's wrong if we don't offer any solutions. So some things that I think we can definitely do are applying strength and conditioning principles. Now in a team setting, the medical staff can be working hand in hand with the performance staff. In private practice, or a lot of times in the youth game, it's important that we have a network to refer to. And if that's not possible, we do need to become educated on some of these principles. For example, we need to be able to train both legs. We know that young female soccer players are at least as likely to injure the opposite leg. The return to sport tests compare one leg to the other. And that really does us no good if the contralateral limb over the course of a several-month rehab program just becomes deconditioned because we're just focusing on the surgical side. We also need to know, train, and test sport and position-specific demands. So I don't need to tell any of you this, I'm sure, but in soccer, we need qualities like rate of force development, strength, power, agility, repeated sprint ability, aerobic capacity, accelerations, decelerations, high-speed running, all the things that some of the other speakers have already discussed and shown data on. Now, it's also important to know that strength tends to decrease as female athletes return to sport. So we definitely need to be giving them a continued strength and conditioning program so that they can maintain their strength when they go back. We can't forget the nervous system, right? So we aren't working with an ACL injury on a soccer player. We're working with a dynamic human being who happens to also have a knee injury. And an ACL injury is, in fact, a disruption to the nervous system. The ACL contains receptors that provide information to the spinal cord and brain. Now, how these messages, now these messages from the receptors in the ACL to the spinal cord and brain are disrupted in presence of an ACL injury. The brain is incredibly adaptable and responds to this by increasing its reliance on visual feedback. Now, this is not ideal for performance because if our visual processing centers of the brain are being used for joint position sense, then there's decreased capacity to process information about the ever-changing environment. There's also decreased cortical excitability for quadriceps contractions after an ACL reconstruction. So that means that it takes more of a stimulus to produce a contraction of the quads. In order to adapt to this, the brain increases its activation in the motor planning areas of the brain, or the premotor cortex. So that means that it's going to take greater motor cortex activation in order to achieve a given motor output. So basically all this means that after an ACL reconstruction, areas of the brain that are typically used to help athletes react and respond to their environment are now being used to help with things like where their knee and leg are in space and driving motor outputs in simple motor tasks that should really be automatic. This may put the athlete at an increased risk of injury because they can't respond to the environment or react to the environment quite as well because those processing centers are being used differently now. So there's so many things for an athlete to think about and react to on the field. Here's just a couple examples. And they really can't afford to be thinking about how bent their knee is when they're changing direction when they have all of these other environmental aspects to be focusing on. Now, some ways that we can help this is reactive training. So here's just a simple drill.
Green, orange, blue, red.
And we can progress
green,
this by
purple,
making each marker
blue,
a number
red,
or a word. So when I
purple,
do this with youth
purple, green,
athletes,
orange.
I'll say that each color corresponds to something that is that color. So for example, purple would be grapes. So if I say grapes, they have to hit the purple marker. If I say the sky, they have to hit the blue marker. You can also really mix it up by making red is green, blue is orange, etc. So now they have to think while doing a simple motor task. And that is specifically for defenders being in the defensive stance, but really any player on the field is going to have to defend at some point, so it's important to train that for everyone. Here's another example. Sorry about the music in the background there. So this is doing some motor dual tasking, and the athlete has to visually track the tennis ball while performing a simple motor task. Now these are very simple soccer technical skills. It's the first things that we learn looking at the soccer ball for the first time. But look how difficult it becomes for me, granted I'm tired now. It becomes so difficult when I'm trying to track the tennis ball. Now here's an athlete I've worked with, and I have her permission to use her image. But so this is an example of a simple motor task that is normally fairly easy for her to perform. So she's doing just some regular juggling, and she's doing pretty well. There's no restrictions on her. But then simple motor tasks become much more challenging when there's a cognitive demand involved.
Okay, now I want you to name all the US states that you can think of while juggling.
So now watch how difficult this becomes for her. You can also have them solve math problems, ask them trivia questions, but the point is that simple motor tasks become so much more difficult in the presence of cognitive or dual motor demands. So the biggest thing that we have to realize is that inherently our role is that of a coach. We're trying to coach an athlete to perform motor tasks that are now novel to them since they haven't been able to perform them due to their surgery. We want athletes to have automaticity on the field. And in order to do that, we really have to drive implicit learning. Implicit learning is that learning where you can't really describe the process of what you're doing, like riding a bicycle. When somebody taught you how to ride a bicycle, it's unlikely that anyone said to you, okay, push down to the ball of your foot while simultaneously pulling the other leg up into maximal hip flexion and knee flexion. Then you're going to go into knee extension on the other side. Nobody taught you that way. They sat you on a bicycle. They maybe held on to the handlebar in the back of your seat and then pushed you on your way, told you to pedal, and once you fell down, you got back up and tried again. And no matter what we do in our lives, if it's been 10 years since you've ridden a bicycle, you can always go back and do it again. Now, you may not be able to explain exactly how you ride a bicycle from a motor output perspective, but we all inherently know how, and that's implicit learning, that's automaticity. So athletes who have described being in the zone, what they're really talking about is having that automaticity. And in fact, having too much conscious control of movement can disrupt that automaticity and can prevent athletes from being in the zone and impairs performance, which we absolutely do not want when our athletes go back onto the field. So some ways that we can help drive implicit learning in the rehab setting is through our cues, our feedback, and the environment. With our cues, we want to always have an external focus. It does no good to say to an athlete, and we do this all the time in rehab, to say, okay, I want you to really look at your quad and make sure that it's contracting as you lift your leg. Because when they go back onto a soccer field, now we know that there's already an adaptation of the brain relying on visual feedback. And by having the athlete stare at their leg while they perform a quad contraction, we're driving that even further. So we want to have an external focus. I like to use cues like, okay, you're going to land on the marker, or explain to them that they have laser beams attached to the front of their kneecaps and the laser beams need to be facing straight ahead at all times, and take away the mirror, right? It's very common that we have athletes stand in front of a mirror to make sure that they're not shifting off of their surgical side. We eventually need to take that mirror away. They need to be able to feel where their body is without that visual reliance, and they also need to be able to have automaticity of movement without thinking too much about it. Now, this is probably true of just any human being in general, but particularly athletes tend to respond better to positive reinforcement than negative. So the feedback I give athletes, I try to make it positive in nature. I'll say things like, hey, that rep was perfect, do every other one just like that. And then that's really making them drive implicit learning because they're thinking, okay, however that felt to me, that's how I have to replicate this going forward. And then I think it's important to gradually decrease the amount of feedback we give. Thirdly, the environment. Now, in a gym-based rehab program, we're in a very controlled and closed environment. When they get back onto the pitch, it's a very chaotic and unpredictable open environment, and we should progress that accordingly. So we can set constraints or put constraints on the activities and the exercises we do to help drive a more open and chaotic environment. And we can help footballers achieve this by implementing an on-field rehab program. And I'm a big proponent of this And this was researchers, a series of 2 studies put forth by Matt Beckthorpe discussing the on-field rehab program for a soccer player. And essentially the key pillars of this is to restore movement quality, improve physical conditioning, restore sport-specific skills, and develop chronic training load. And I would add to that this also really helps with psychological readiness. If an athlete goes through this entire process, by the end of it, stepping onto the pitch for a game is going to be no big deal to them because they've already felt comfortable having the soccer ball at their feet, being back with their team, training regularly, etc. Now, this is where a lot of athletes fall through the cracks, especially in the setting I work in. They get cleared to play, return to the team for training, and don't often have a progression to get back to regular training. So I'll quickly show you a little bit of what these look like. So phase 1 is just linear movement, and here we're focused on movement quality. And so we needed to work quite a bit on movement quality here. So things like walking marches, skipping, jogging, lunging, all fall into the linear movement category. Phase 2 is going to be multidirectional movements, and here we want to increase linear speeds. So we want to start exposing them to high-speed running, increasing their total running distances, and also introduce pre-planned multidirectional movements. As far as soccer-specific skills go, we can also include easy technical skills in this phase. Phase 3, we want to add more soccer-specific technical skills, so pre-planned soccer-specific drills, including a technical program. We want to add reactive training and decision-making, so cutting and change of direction while responding to an external stimulus. And this is going to be without a soccer ball first. So you can see here, I'm pointing to the athlete which direction I want her to take the ball after she receives it. So really easy technical skills, but we're adding a bit of multi-directional component and a bit of a reactive component. So wherever she plays the ball, that's where I have to go to receive the ball. This is a couple examples of how to do that. I changed the clip before I messed up on my next pass. That was pre-planned. In phase 4, we're going to be focused on soccer-specific movements. So here we're progressing them towards team practice intensity. We're adding chaos and pressure. So here's a 1v1 environment going to goal. So we can do 1v1s, but at this point it's still going to be non-contact in nature. We can have reaction, we can give slight perturbations. And then phase 5 doesn't really require a video because it's just training simulation. So we're trying to make this look like a team training session. 1v1, 2v2, crossing and finishing drills, possession scenarios, rondos, etc. We're also trying to increase their chronic workload to be that of pre-injury volume. Now again, the whole return to sport process should be seen as a continuum, not just some magical day in the future. And I think that this on-field rehab program really helps to drive that home. And then lastly, you may have noticed that many aspects of these interventions include aspects and roles from the entire team: strength and conditioning, medical, psych, sports science, coaching, etc. So we need this interdisciplinary approach with the athlete at the center. Every voice matters, but none more so than the athletes. As Dawn said earlier, in recent past, staff members had more range, and now there are specialists for everything. But we still need someone or some members of the staff to have at least a basic understanding of other roles so that they can integrate information from all of these specialties together for the bigger picture. Now, I did just finish reading Range, so maybe there's some recency bias there, but I think that this is really important for getting the athlete back to sport with a reduced risk of second injury.